Okay, I'd like to thank everyone for coming this evening. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank the Vision RT team for inviting me to talk and to share our experience with using OSMS, because ours is the variant-branded version of Vision RT, for position monitoring during VMAT SRS. So I'm going to talk tonight about our experience for a very specific application. First, my disclosures. Vision RT is sponsoring my travel here. I don't know if I needed to add the Varian stuff, but because it's a Varian product, I figure it doesn't hurt. We have research and product development agreements with Varian, and then we've also licensed some technology that we call the virtual cone to Varian, and both UAB and myself receive royalty fees for that. So, we use service guidance for SRS. It's not a setup tool. I mean, we use it because it's fast and efficient, but that's not really the primary goal for us. CBCT is really the gold standard for SRS. And so our primary focus is on monitoring relative to the initial position. And the detection of changes is more important for us than absolute positioning in the room. So when we're monitoring, what do we do when we see an offset during treatment? And from discussions with other clinics as well as the literature, there seems to be quite a bit of variation about how people utilize OSMS. There was this publication, I think it's 2012 in Practical Radiation Oncology, describing where when deltas were observed, they would make shifts based on those OSMS adjustments. We don't do that, and I'm going to share some data with you for why we don't do it. For us, cone beam is really the gold standard. So here's our workflow for OSMS. I'm going to turn and look at it because I can't see it very well. So this is to align the patient to the simulation marks, and that's usually pretty fast. And then we adjust the patient position with OSMS, take a KV ortho set, and use real-time, Varian calls it 2D to 3D matching. So it's basically a dynamic live DRR in the image registration to create a 6 degree of freedom setup. After that, we then do a cone beam CT with a 6 degree of freedom couch to perform the shifts. We have an internal tolerance of 0.5 millimeter and 0.5 degree as the rule of thumb for whether or not we're going to repeat a cone beam CT after we apply the shifts. As one of my colleagues puts it, I don't have any data on that, it sort of seems like a good idea. Once we're okay with the shifts, we proceed to treatment. We capture a reference surface before the first beam on. So we tell OSMS this is where the patient's supposed to be, we're ready to go. And then during treatment, we monitor and look to see if our action limits are exceeded. Now the action limits are also a little like this. They're on the order of 0.7 of a millimeter to a millimeter. It depends a little bit on the clinical situation. So we might be a little more nervous and more likely to stop if it's a trigem than we would maybe on a single isocenter 2 centimeter lesion, for example. So, but rule of thumb, it's somewhere between 0.75 of a millimeter and a millimeter. If we see that those OSMS reports an offset larger than our tolerance, we bring the patient back, the table angle back to 0, and look at OSMS again. And the reason is because we notice that as, okay, we're back to Netflix. So, what we do is we bring the patient back because we've noticed that when the table is not at 0, there are some systematic offsets, and like I said, we've quantified those, and I'm going to share that data with you. But we know that there are some systematic offsets, and so if we see an offset when the table's not 0, we bring it back to 0 because we have a high confidence in OSMS at the neutral table position. If the offsets persist, then we do another cone beam CT, go through our image-guided setup process until we're happy, capture a new reference surface, and proceed to treatment. And back to our regularly scheduled program. So this is our first step, and then when in doubt, we cone beam CT. So forever unsure, we go back to the gold standard for submillimetric SRS positioning. So UAB, we have a philosophy. We've implemented many clinical projects where over time we've gathered a lot of experience that we've wanted to share with the outside world, but we have no quantitative data. And so we go, well, we know all this, we've got all this data, we'll go back and we'll get that data and we'll show what we know to be anecdotally true. And we found that that's never a fun exercise and often never very rewarding. So we've learned to build in data gathering into our clinical processes from their inception. And so we did that with OSMS. We said, we're going to gather data on this clinical process. The first thing we did is we said, we're going to capture data. At the time, this is when the OSMS software would allow you to capture that Microsoft Word report manually by pushing a button. So we told our therapists, capture that report at these time points. And then about 6 to 8 weeks into our experience, the physics team said it's time to analyze that data, and it was uninterpretable. It was uninterpretable because sometimes there would be a report missing, sometimes there would be, like, where did the extra report come from? And so we realized we really needed to log the data as it was captured. And so we developed a log, and our therapists, every day, they print this out. It's just a report, an ARIA report, that looks for the word OSMS or brain in the comments and puts it on this worksheet. And this is these are two examples. So this is a patient. They note what the skin tone setting was, what device we used to immobilize the patient. This is the same every day now. I mean, we've switched to this device permanently last fall. And then there's a whole list of things that we might want to know. Was there a propagation warning? Were there any other warning or error messages? Was there more than one reference surface capture? So we go through these list of things that we know that happened. So for this patient, everything was good. For this patient, there was more than one reference surface capture, and because there was mid-treatment imaging, and the therapist will write a comment, there was an OSMS deviation of 2 millimeters. They brought the patient back and they did imaging. So then the physics team periodically goes through these logs and captures the little real-time delta log files saved by OSMS. We don't gather the ones that, for which there was some oddity that happened, and we don't gather those because they're really hard to interpret. Now, we do keep track of how many, and there really aren't very many that have aberrations like this. It's probably less than 5%. So after there was a software update, we stopped gathering those individual word reports. Instead, we used that real-time delta file, and we have some in-house software that pulls those reports and correlates them with beams and ARIA. It does some sanity checks, like it makes sure that the whole fraction fits inside the time span recorded by the report, and then it looks for the timestamp of each beam on and matches that up with the real-time delta log file, and so it captures the real-time deltas for us at each beam on. It captures the real-time deltas at each beam off, and when our therapists finish treatment, they know to bring the table back to neutral and wait a moment before they stop the monitoring, so we have an end of treatment time point. So that software then emits a little JSON file for those of you who are complete nerds. It's a little human readable file, but software can parse it. And so it looks like this. It tells you who the patient was, what the plan was, what the time point was. So this is a before a treatment beam, and that treatment beam had a table angle of 315, and the gantry was head down. And then it's got all the real-time deltas. And so this is our data feed. Okay, so now I'm going to share with you what we've learned from this data gathering process over really 3 time periods. So the first period was our initial experience. Our second period was after a change called Advanced Camera Optimization, or ACO. And our third period was at the beginning of this year, Align RT released or Vision RT, I can never remember which is the product, in which, I'm sorry. When Vision RT released a customer information bulletin making some small tweaks to how that MV isocenter calibration was done. I'm going to share with you what we've learned and what the effects of those changes. So what you're looking at here is on the left side is at the end of treatment. So this tells you sort of, in some sense, where OSMS thinks the patient was at the end of treatment with the couch at neutral. And you can see a very tight distribution. Now remember, we've pretty much thrown out all the patients for which we knew there was actual motion. So what we're doing here is we're really using patient data where we believe that at the end of treatment there was no significant motion, at least none that triggered action. And then we're going to look at the performance of OSMS during treatment. And so you can see that there's a very tight distribution, and the median here is a few tenths of a millimeter, about 3 to 5 tenths of a millimeter. So at the end of treatment, these look very good. But if you look at before beam on for all of the non-coplanar beams, so this is typically 45 degrees on either side or more, you can see that there's quite a large distribution, with some being reported up to 2 millimeters. And the 50% of these are almost a millimeter. So this is that sort of systematic shift. If I parse it and I look at just the longitudinal, because that's what our therapists and the physicists who were attending the procedures tended to note, was it seemed to happen mostly in the longitudinal direction, you can see that there's a systematic offset of between 0.7 millimeters and 1 millimeter when you rotate the couch off axis in the longitudinal direction. We went back into our treatment planning system. Now one thing I haven't showed you examples of, and I'll be happy to share with you later, but we don't create our ROI on the fly at the machine. Instead, we contour the opening in our open face mask in Eclipse with appropriate margin, and then when our therapists import that and generate their ROI from that. So we, number one, have a very systematic way of generating our ROI that's not user dependent. Number two, we have the ROI, some approximation of the ROI in Eclipse. And so we can go and we can look at the isocenter relative to the ROI. And what we found was the deeper the isocenter was, that is, the more posterior it was. I mean, this data has a lot of scatter in it, but there's definitely, if you sort of look at the left and look at the right, you can see a difference. And so there's a trend to the deeper the isocenter, the more likely you are to get the larger of a longitudinal offset, a false positive you're going to get. So I believe it was in late 2017, just after AAPM last year, Vision RT came to our center and applied what was called advanced camera optimization to our cameras. And the way I understand that is the cameras have a model of the optical path in that camera. And that's used in the software to then create the depth map and then the 3D surface. And so instead of using the default model for the camera, a camera-specific model was created using optical targets, and then each camera had its own model. So it wasn't really a software change, but it was a change from the standard default model of each camera to a camera-specific model. That resolved this isocenter position issue. So here's data after ACO, in which versus the ROI, the offset. So this is now going this way is depth, posterior depth. And you can see that there's essentially very little systematic deviation as a function of depth. But you can see there is, however, still a systematic longitudinal offset of, I think this is wrong units, it's about it's half a millimeter, not half a centimeter. So in late December, we got it in early January. There was a customer information bulletin released that I'll show here. So there was a recommended change in workflow to the MV isocenter calibration, and the purpose of it was to make sure that how those positions of the phantom were captured was consistent with the rest of the system calibration procedures. Now, what does that mean? Now, one thing we knew very early in our experience with the system was that it has a temperature drift. It has a warm-up time. And we measured it with a static phantom. I mean, this is nothing new. I think other users have seen this. If you put a static phantom on the table and you start monitoring, over approximately 10 to 15 minutes, you'll see a systematic drift in the reported position. And we correlated that with the board temperature reported by the cameras themselves, and sure enough, you see a correlation. And so our process for patient care is when we call the patient back into the room, as we're calling the patient back in the room, the therapists start the monitoring process because that's where the warm-up is happening. And they set up the patient, we go out, we do our image guidance procedures, and by the time we're ready to treat and capture a reference surface, it's been about 10 minutes and the cameras have thermally stabilized. So the physics team thought that was the right way to calibrate as well. And so we would tend to calibrate here, but the recommendation is actually to capture your offsets here, to not let the cameras warm up. And evidently that has to do with, as the CIB points out, consistency with other calibration procedures. And so at our institution, we started to call it the cold camera calibration. We were skeptical, but it makes a difference. So what I'm showing you here is a histogram of the frequency of real-time deltas for non-coplanar beams before and after we applied this calibration procedure. So the red is between advanced camera optimization, but before the CIB, and the blue is after the CIB. And you can see a very notable difference, and the shift is about 0.2 of a millimeter. And you get a much lower incidence of these sort of millimeter plus excursions. So this is another way of looking at the data. This is before the CIB, but now these two histograms are, this is at the end of treatment, and this is after the last coplanar beam. So we took the after beam time point for the last beam. So the only difference between these two is the table rotation from beam off back to the neutral position. So there's very little time between these two time points. And you can see that there's a significant difference between the end of the last coplanar beam and when you finish treatment. But after the CIB, you can see that that curve shifts significantly to the left. So, oops, let me see if I can go back. So if you do like this, you can see that the end of treatment distribution is the same, which it should be, but the off-axis distribution has gotten smaller. So in our thinking about this, we've also thought about how do we not only how do we evaluate this, but how do we do QA. And so our monthly QA, we wanted to monitor the performance under conditions similar to those used in treatment. And so we have a styrofoam head embedded with a 6mm tungsten ball. One of my colleagues is pretty sure she's on a watch list because she called places asking if they had any heads. We capture, so it's like a table walkout test. So we capture the BB position on the EPID, and we also capture the surface position on OSMS at 22.5-degree table increments. And we look at the difference between the two. So we're subtracting couch walkout from the OSMS report. So here's the head. We've got a little mount for it to put it on the bracket. You can get these at any craft store for just a few bucks. You'll probably have a harder time finding the tungsten BB. So here's a picture of that test. So you can see as we're rotating the table, we're getting the real-time deltas, and we actually process this with in-house software using the log files. And up on the upper left is the EPID image, and you can sort of see the BB moving around with the couch walkout. So this is the difference between couch walkout and OSMS. So this is sort of OSMS error. And you can see it's on the order of 1/3 of a millimeter. Seems to be a little bit worse at the 45s. This 270 probably is the worst point. But, to compare that with the couch walkout test using our standard Winston-Lutz setup, you can see our couch walkout is somewhere around 1/3 to 4/10 of a millimeter. So OSMS has sort of a baked-in uncertainty that's of the order of the couch walkout itself. So our conclusion is really OSMS is with the ACO and the new recommended calibration procedure is really giving you information to sub-half millimeter accuracy. But its uncertainty is still on the order of the couch walkout, so you probably can't really use it to correct for couch walkout during treatment. We think it's a great system, but we also think you'd probably have to push it to probably sub-10th millimetric accuracy before you would, it would begin to supersede cone beam as your final gold standard during treatment. So finally, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues. In particular, Dr. Elizabeth Covington on the left has done a lot of the work on OSMS, has been involved really almost since the beginning of our OS implementation. She arrived at UAB during that time. And then on the right are all the faculty, including radiation oncologists and neurosurgeons who are involved in our very active SRS program. So thank you for your attention before dinner.